thank you so much for inviting me for this talk, and I will show you a few of the 3D animations and a sound installation, and I hope it will take around 30 minutes, and then Lars Bang Larsen and me will briefly elaborate on some of these ideas, these projects, and also interest in science fiction. So, science fiction is a literature of cognitive estrangement, a genre of defamiliarization that can place the reader in a world different from our own in ways that stimulate thought about the nature of those differences, and can cause us to view our present world from an alternative perspective. It is also a genre that takes on many appearances, a genre of pulp-style narratives of heroic space travelers battling aliens with laser guns, or devastating wars against giant ants, and etc. However, hidden within this jungle of stereotypes and cultural images, there is also a strong tradition for experimentation with narrative and visual form. Science fiction is a laboratory where all kinds of possibilities and scenarios can be tested and staged and put into play. In this way, it also has a highly subversive potential. It can be a laboratory for critical reflection on reality and power, gender roles and sexuality, for speculations about the unknown and our ever elusive future, and for speculation about utopia, as we have heard a lot about these last days. My interest in utopia comes less from Thomas More's idea of an ideal community or society possessing a perfect socio-political and legal system, a good place, which is no place. As this space is evoked, one immediately asks, utopia, but for whom? A more relevant reference in this context is, of course, heterotopia. The heterotopias of time, such as museums, or the heterotopias of compensation, spaces that are other. Another example that Foucault uses to illustrate his idea is a garden, which can be a heterotopic, a heterotopia, since it's a real place that juxtaposes several spaces or environments with plants from all around the world. And this is Max Ernst's cover for The Crystal World, by the way. I think of this in relation to my work Crystal World, which I see as a garden of some sort. In the piece there are crystalline growth and several other juxtaposed spaces of plants, but more so of artistic and architectural worlds. I will do a short outline of the work and show you some images, and it will be kind of very brief, but just so that you all have an idea of where I speak from. So, Crystal World, after J.G. Ballard from 2006, is a double-channel projection first shown at the São Paulo Biennale same year. And in the 3D animation, a universe, a world is constructed with architectural elements and a jungle that slowly crystallizes. A text generated from a letter written by the protagonist Sander in J.G. Ballard's novel describes a zone of entropy, a process of transformation and crystallization. The animation moves through spaces, combining architectural elements of Lina Bobardi's Casa di Vidro and Oscar Niemeyer's Matarazzo Pavilion, both built in São Paulo. And get dry. When I first visited São Paulo doing a research trip, I had Ballard's book with me and was struck by this melting in my mind of these two versions of the future, one in book form and one in the form of Brazilian modernist architecture, which became important for my animation Crystal World. Also, some artworks from other artists are animated in this 3D space or universe. The novel Crystal World has many ties to art from the 60s and early 70s. Robert Smithson quoted the Crystal World in his writings. and was interested in some of the themes, like the idea of temporality, crystals, mirrors, and entropy. Besides Smithson, The Dead Tree, 1969, I've also included Untitled Rope Piece from 1970 by Eva Hesse, and other references which together with the architectural elements are reactivated in the animation as sort of characters, I would say. In this way, ideas of temporality, time, entropy, and transformation in late modernity is played out in what could be termed a mental landscape. So here you see the dead tree of Smithson. It's destroyed. Contains of trees, the tree and the mirrors underneath it. And Smithson writes, sometimes I think the whole universe is a hall of mirrors, reflections reflecting reflections. And here you can see the piece, or the tree, the dead tree, put into the 3D universe. And here you can see it from a very different perspective, also lying in some sort of a ruin of a space, I would say. And this is another Smithson from 65, 64, and I've just shown, I only show it because it is not visible, or it was never visible in the animation itself, but in the universe it's played out, but you don't see it in the projection. And the same with this one, four-sided vortex from 65. And Andrei Gasiorek writes on Ballard that Ballard insists that neither the history of the 20th century and maybe even early 21st century, nor the significant features of the contemporary landscape can probably be grasped in the terms of conventional narrative forms. For Ballard, it's not just a question of crossbreeding genres and unsettling the boundaries between them, but of tackling late 20th century life in literary forms that do justice to other confusions, ambiguities, and unresolved dilemmas. And here you also see Eva Hesse, the untitled, almost spider web from the 70s. And here are some depicted Lina Bobardi's chairs, designed by her. And this is I mean, Madsbauer Kurt Schwitters looks like a cave that is crystallizing, and Kurt Schwitters once remarked that everything that was of any importance to him was contained in the Madsbau. This statement refers to not only to his ideas and overall concepts, but also to concrete everyday objects, souvenirs of friends, and other things of sentimental value were stored in niches and later walled in. There were grottos for Miss van der Rohe, a cave for Lisinski, as well as grottos dedicated to abstract things and concepts. And so consequently, the Madsbau was a kind of constructed autobiography, a building of personal and historical reminiscences. So you could also say that Schwitter's grotto became a space for feelings, ideas, and narratives, but narratives without conventional characters. The conventional characters as we know them from literature or film, as the talking heads, so to speak. So here is a small detail from the São Paulo Matarazzo Pavilion by Oscar Niemeyer that also appears in the animation, and that also is the space for the São Paulo Biennale. And here you see Lina Bobardi's house, Casa de Vidro. And what is you will see here that it's a very open landscape around it. It's only the tea plantages and the glass house. Casa de Vidro means, the glass house. Oliveira writes, it is a halfway house. It's half transparent, half opaque, half public, half private, half modern, half traditional, half aerial, half aquatic, half lying on the ground, half standing on pilotis, a house that is frail, temporary, ready to display itself and disappear. It is a cupboard house, a backpack house, where we keep the essentials for life. And going there, seeing it today, I found that the vegetation, as you can see, had totally changed. The trees were much taller than the house, and the building seemed to be placed in the middle of a jungle. And the house itself also had big repairs to be done to keep it. So it is as if the house was asked to disappear. As the years go by, the house is in fact losing its importance in relation to its surroundings, nature, the objects it accumulates, and also the life that is developed there. In a way similar to Smithson's idea of it and entropy. And here you see the chairs by Lina Bobardi. This is probably the prototypes that she had. Like I said before, the universe can be seen in the context of Foucault's heterotopic garden as a sort of other space. Or maybe a dystopia, a reduced world of memories and experiences, strangely seductive and menacing at the same time. So I'll introduce the notion of what-if scenarios. We have already spoken about it a few times, but utopia can be described as such a scenario, and a way to address our present political, social, and psychological state through setting up an imaginary alternative. Science fiction as a genre often uses the notion of the what-if scenario. This is why certain issues are addressed almost exclusively in this field. The genre makes a space for speculation not often found elsewhere by introducing narratives like, what if time went backwards? What if we could remember everything? What if we are all asleep and dreaming? Or in the case of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, what if our gender is not fixed and we can alternate between being male and female almost by will? So, Left Hand of Darkness, after Ursula Le Guin from 2008, is a 3-channel animation that projects a swirl of objects, laid pages of text, choreographed dancing bodies, and a set of anatomical drawings of human genitalia. The literary reference in Ursula K. Le Guin's 1969 science fiction novel about a civilization where gender is provisional and change according to emotional desire on the journey On the journey across a distant intergalactic laser, a man becomes a woman, and mind speech is the language of communication. The animated hypnotic rotary disc points towards an alternative spatial logic and also to the rotary disc of Duchamp. Other references in the work include experimental film of Maya Deren, Meditation of Violence, and Edgar Allan Poe's A Descent into the Maelstrom. The animation Left Hand of Darkness is a what-if scenario structured around the idea of a world that does not hold the limitations inscribed in our gender and bodies. In the project, the association is used as an instrument for the rereading or reactivating of some of Le Guin's ideas. The animation conjures a 3D world of trance, subjectivity, exchange, and disintegration, as if we were suddenly caught in a dream of I, the bewildered alien protagonist in the story. Also, Le Guin's ideas for another kind of language, mind speech, interested me a lot in this project. And I have in my earlier sound pieces worked with different concepts and approaches to language. A language of repetition, looping, layering, and multiple voices. And I see the idea of mind speech as a possibility for a vibrational communication, a different way to transmit information, a mental image made visual, or a language that is not defined by syntax of beginning, middle, and end. I found it interesting that even what is not heard or seen could be understood as a part of the mind-speech language, and wanted to see if layered text could be understood this way. So the speed of the passing pages are varied, and the density of the lines can sometimes make it hard to read, but mostly sentences and words are legible and continues to generate new meaning over time. As I mentioned, it is not a strict reworking of scenes from Ursula Le Guin's book, but a world of associations generated from the notion of a double gender. So Donna Haraway writes, "This is a dream not of a common language, but of a powerful infidel heteroglossia." Heteroglossia means a diversity of voices, style, and concepts for you that maybe don't know the word. It means both building and destroying machines, identities, categories, relationships, space, and stories. Though both are bound in the spiral dance, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess, she says. Maybe the characters in Left Hand of Darkness can be seen as cyborgs. This piece has absolutely taken me the longest to structure, build, and finish. And some of my research notes are Maya Deren's Meditation of Violence that I choreographed with 3 actors, 2 women and 1 man, made to look like each other to a confusing degree, and also her notes on a vertical structure of images as an alternative to the linear narrative structure for film. So instead, Maya Deren, promoted a poetic or vertical film characterized by downward plunge as an alternative to an horizontal development. So Ursula Le Guin writes in The Left Hand of Darkness that I saw, and I saw then again and for good what I had always been afraid to see and had pretended not to see in him, that he was a woman as well as a man. Any need to explain the sources for that fear vanished with the fear. What I was left with was at last acceptance of him as he was. Until then I had rejected him, refused him his own reality. The soundtrack, let me see. Can you hear a little sound? Is the sound on?
Worked yesterday, right?
Yeah, it worked yesterday. Let me see.
Because the sound is in there.
Yeah. Can you hear anything at all? Or I can, well, let me see. I think actually. Since it worked yesterday, I'll just double check something. It will take a second. Come on. Right? What? I just need to find my. Ska vi klara det? Kommer det nu? there will be some more sounds, so it was important to have it. Okay. So the soundtrack of Left Hand of Darkness is a pulsating pink, brown, and white noise. And in the context of the seminar, one could ask, is there noise in Utopia? And what kind of sounds might we hear in Utopia? Just let it go a little bit, because it changes quite a lot. It pulsates like this for a while and changes quite a lot over time. William Burroughs has said about the cut-up technique, when we cut into the present, the future leaks out. And this idea is relevant for the next work I'm going to show, which is the multi-layered sound installation science fiction 3114 or 3114, was produced by manipulating the soundtracks of landmark science fiction films, Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville and Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451, also a movie that we spoke about already, and Tchaikovsky's Solaris and his Stalker, and Luc Besson's The Fifth Element. So the science fiction genre, just like Utopia, is a cultural image, a way to create, compartmentalize, and frame scenarios about our present, future, and also the unknown. I see these films as cultural manifestations of our ideas of the future and the unknown. But by rearranging the narratives, I wanted to defamiliarize the scenarios. I wanted to make the future unknown again, so to speak, to make it a resource. So here we get a little bit. It's 28 minutes, but just so you have, I'll just show you some images of how it once was installed. And this is in a black space, and you can see that it's this leak of light. Just have it in the background. That is in the end of the space, so to speak, and it's the only light in the whole room. So it's a very spatial and dynamic soundtrack that moves around. And when you peek behind the leaning wall in front of the light, you see, in this case, it's fiction only streaming out, but it says science fiction. Sometimes it comes with science first, and other times it's all hidden, and other times fiction flips out. So an earlier sound work based on Kubrick's soundtrack for 2001, A Space Odyssey, was installed in a former chemical depository in Copenhagen. And the sound is played from 2 exterior speakers mounted behind air vents, playing at multiple speeds. The past and the future became fused into the physical surroundings, and the spectator, listener, or accidental wanderer entered in this way a stage framed by waves of manipulated time, you could say. So I see these sound works not necessarily as played in exhibition venues, but also as on-site audio interventions. As the soundtrack reverberates off of familiar buildings, it establishes a parallel, temporal, and spatial frame, and I hope to add a speculative use value to these everyday spaces to make a vibrational roadmap of sorts for possible becomings. So I think this is this for now. And yeah, should we?
I'm going to join Anne and I've prepared some questions.
Ooh.
I will throw at her. So we heard Anne opening up the question of Utopia in a skeptical or questioning way in relation to her work, and addressing the dystopic and the hetero topic along the way. And in my mind, Anne's way of talking about utopia and heterotopia connects to something that Jean Baudrillard wrote in the late 60s in an early essay called Utopia Deferred. And it was actually written for the magazine called Utopia that he wrote for in his youth. And in this essay, Baudrillard makes a beautiful deconstruction of the notion of utopia. And he addresses utopia in terms of ambivalence or irritation, rather than in terms of a homeland or a privileged political space. So I'll just throw this. I think it's also something that connects to what Stephen was talking about this morning. So I'll just throw in this quote. Baudrillard writes, quote, "Utopia is never spoken, it's never on the agenda. It's always repressed in the identity of political, historical, logical, dialectical orders. Utopia also haunts and crosses them irrevocably, forcing them into an overstatement of rationality. Utopia does not write itself into the future. It is always, from right now, what the order of the day is missing. Utopia is the ambivalence which crosses every order, every institution, every rationality, even revolutionary rationality, every positivity, no matter what, and returns them to their non-place. Utopia is the deconstruction of any unilateral finality of man or history." So, of course, such a sort of breaking apart of the concept of utopia was perhaps more resonant in the late 60s than it is today, but it's significant that it's a deconstruction of the idea of utopia, of the utopia of that has a telos, that has a goal. Baudrillard's utopia is not the Marxist utopia of the, where we roll up our sleeves and then at the end of the next 5-year plan there is a bright new society. To me, Baudrillard's ways of talking about utopia perhaps accommodates aesthetic thinking and art's resistance to instrumentalization. And when one talks about utopia as ambivalence or irritation, the utopian perhaps has a character of a thought experiment, perhaps. So it's not something that's about. It's not about controlling social processes in a beneficial way. It's rather about confronting truths that have become tired, or confronting what we thought we knew about society, and confronting these notions in a way that lies outside of the imaginary gratification of a certain fetishized time or space. that was a more general remark. Perhaps sort of more prosaically, I could ask you how your digital animations come into being and your use of technology. I mean, how is it actually made, and how does this type of method accommodate this cognitive estrangement that you talked about, the cognitive estrangement of science fiction world?
Yeah, let's get practical somehow, but of course new technologies are always fascinating, and I guess I've worked with animation for some time as other medias, but I think what is in the mid-90s also After Effects, that we probably all know the name of it, at least, even if we don't use it on an everyday scale, and 3D animation, the computer as a place where many different kind of softwares could be mixed and put together in maybe in the beginning, just thinking that suddenly it was possible to build up a 3D universe and place a person into it. That was not at all part of that room. Very simple, very basic, and I think in the beginning I thought of animation as a maybe more like a collage, like a possible collage of places and spaces and sometimes beings, maybe not human beings, but other beings. And then after that, it became more like that universe of the computer itself. I looked at it more like a theater set or a theater stage where you could stage different scenarios. But then I would say now it's more like a hybrid of all different kind of technologies that not really can be compared with any experience that I really had other places in other situations. And somehow it's, for example, building up a universe or a world with different kind of elements. It maybe seem like a universe, or looks like that. It could be the Earth, it could be our own galaxy, so to speak. But when you dive into it, 1 centimeter on the computer could be, I mean, miles in reality, and you can be both places at the same time, and that is very unusual, to both be very close and into the pixel of the information, and then at the same time somehow see it in this enormous perspective. So scale is a very different kind of experience. And also another thing that you might know, but working with it, it becomes almost real, that these different layers of information that are placed in the universe, you can also, with a click of a mouse, very fast only see a detail, or you can see through buildings. You see only the concrete buildings without any windows. Suddenly you are inside it or outside it at the same time, or you can just have the visuality of the corner, or as you might saw, that the buildings can float, so you don't have gravity in the same way. So every rule you put into it is somehow happening on its own, at least when there are many different kinds of rules. So that's probably my fascination of animation, and more this kind of possibility of experiences, objects and space and beings and places in a very, very different way. But this Crystal World, for example, is this hybrid of 2D photographs, analog photographs, digital photographs, snapshots, technical camera imageries. It's 3D buildings. Yeah, and also, of course, it's all built up in this program called Maya, which is also a program that is used by film industry, and I'm sure you remember the elephants in Lords of the Rings, for example, are Maya constructions. Yeah. So, but these, now you only saw partly 2 of the pieces, but they are all built up very, very differently. The first animation was built up, constructed, you will not see it here, but only by light, very, very strong colors. And it was like an architectural, very basic construction, and the camera moves around in that labyrinth. But immediately, if you cut out the light, the building and all the elements disappear. It's not so that you just walk in the dark and can bounce into the walls, not seeing them. So it's not about seeing, it's present somehow. Or it is a premise of what that construction is, or how that construction is working. And the same actually with Crystal World. This may be more complex. It's different kind of media that are mixed, but it's still very basic. It's very easy to look through the elements. You can see that this is not a real 3D3. It must be an image of it, for example.
And you work with programmers?
Yes,
is there like a whole workshop of you, or how does it?
No, it's only me and one other, actually, in this. I've worked with different animators, but I'm very happy not to know the technical part in depth, also because it's changing so fast and it's so time-consuming, and it is still very time-consuming to do these projects. But it's a very long process, also of experimentation, and I think that process of building up or finding different possible spaces or places to structure is a very long run. And it's not to find the perfect, but maybe to find something that I don't know yet what will be, and still having that idea from rereading and trying to reactivate some of the ideas in the novels that I find interesting still, and think it's important to somehow construct, but not to illustrate them, but rather to reactivate the ideas, but in a way that I don't know before I start.
Yeah, there are many ways, sort of approaches into your production and to your research, which you have talked about here, and one is literature. Another question that your work opens up to is the siting of Utopia, the place of Utopia, or the place of the avant-garde. And I think that's a question that concerns Crystal World in particular, and the way you refer to Brazil and the Brazilian avant-garde of the 20th century in that work of Niemeyer and Lina Bobardi. And also Brazil as such, that has been called all through the 20th century. It was the land of the future. Sort of, it was never realized as the land of the future, but it always had that potential. And anyway, if you look at it from the point of view of globalization, I mean, globalization has a long history, particularly from the perspective of developing countries or third world countries or ex-colonies. Places that have been strongly interdependent on Europe or have been subject to colonial domination. And avant-garde studies have suggested that there are sort of the various versions of the modernist avant-garde movements. So unlike the European avant-garde movements, which were mainly concerned with time, with temporalities of progress, then the Latin American avant-gardes undertook a critique of modernity and its narratives through a particular attention to space. So that means that European avant-gardes, futurism, constructivism, etc., have been more concerned with thinking up timelines along which one could accelerate into a utopia or into futurity or regress back to a primitivism, for example. But the Latin American avant-gardes have a different perception of this, because they did not perceive the ideas of the avant-garde as universal, because these ideas came from somewhere. They came from Europe, for example. So Latin American avant-garde rather focused on a Latin American situation in a shifting world order, seeing that ideas always come from somewhere. They always have a trajectory. Utopia didn't come as a transparent idea to Latin America, you could say. And of course, this Latin American perspective could be compared to the way that the European loses his autonomy and integrity in the jungle of Ballard's crystal world. But maybe you could talk about differences you perceived between a European-style modernism and a Brazilian-style modernism when you were doing your research for Crystal World in Brazil.
This will only be as an observation. But it was really interesting for me to somehow bring. First of all, I had some ideas of Bruno Taut, which Nils also spoke about yesterday before I came to Brazil, thinking of the crystal and this idea of the glass, the transparency that would change our way of living. And then having that book, as I said, in my reading that while I was in Sao Paulo, and then doing the walks, walking around, looking at the architecture, going to Via
Paulista Avenue?
Yeah, Paulista Avenue. This big avenue, if you've ever been there, this where you have high-rise building, closing off a street, bank after bank, money, and of course expensive shops. And then suddenly walking that via, you had this opening, and behind you could see the panorama of the city, and it was then looking underneath the belly of MASP, the museum of 19th century art that Lina Bobardi built. And I thought it was a very, very different approach to space, and somehow lifting the building up so that it was space for people to crash, to demonstrate, to sit down, and then also to see the city you were in, but not watching actually the palaces, but looking at the city as that raw backside, almost looking at the shadow of the city, and still feeling that it was this overview of something more real than that a wall I went through first. And all in all, till more I researched and till more I looked into modernist architecture in Brazil, I found it so differently approached than European architecture, which is it can be very functional. It is definitely the machinery without the oil somehow. But being in Brazil, it was so much more the body, the placement of the body was always, or very often, taken into account. The place around it. It was also a very, like Lina Bobardi had a very social approach to what to build and how to build it, in a very experimental way. She also, in this museum that is a little bit like her own house, but not made in glass, on 4 pilates, colored red, and then the building is somehow a block on top of those. And you enter also the building from the belly, so to speak, and up in. But inside she had these ideas of showing the collection in a very different way than any European museum I think ever maybe thought of. Like we always see it the building paintings hanging on the wall, and you walk around and you read somehow the line of history or the narratives. But Lina Bobardi had this idea that, or she built these glass holders and place then the paintings onto them, but in the middle of the space and behind each other, so that you as a viewer actually moved along. You saw also the paintings from the back side, not only from the front side, and you saw them all as a bunch of actors or protagonists, so to speak. And I thought that was, that was a little very special experience. And of course, seeing her glass house, and she made other projects like something called Pesque Pompeii, where she also very much engaged the people that would use it, and building up space for theater and dance and aerobics and and more leisure-like.
But there was a collectivist aspect to her work as well. She involved the workers in the planning of some of the buildings, I think.
Which is at least, I don't know about these ideas in Europe in the same way, at least. No. And also, of course, just visiting Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, which was built in 4 years from scratch. And now it's years after, and I was so lucky to have this architect, very young architect, that suddenly got this job for the time of his life. He could stay there till he died. He was told that he was 32, and his job was somehow to decide what to renovate first, because already now the houses and buildings are falling very much apart, and I would say the climate of Brazil is a very different one than at least the northern Scandinavian climate, which can hold very much longer, I guess. But it is, Brasilia is almost like a 3D world, 3D universe, because it's so constructed. But then you have this entropy and falling apart, and very interesting and fascinating.
You've been talking about the way you create worlds and produce images, but there's also a sort of a strong current in your work where you relativize the image. I mean, that's true for the sound works, definitely, where you lift the soundtracks of science fiction movies and then manipulate the soundtracks in different ways. So you take away the image of Kubrick's 2001, for example, or The Fifth Element by Luc Besson, or whatever, but the soundtrack is there, and it's still very evocative because you know that that's the source. So there's sort of this play of absent images. There's also a sort of relativization of the image in Left Hand of Darkness, but that's more in the dimension of time. I would say that there is this undertow in the work of a different time than the time of the viewer, because the three screens are not synchronized. So they meet once every 45 days. Once every 45 days, you will see the same image there, and so that kind of random process is quite fascinating to me, because it's a way of another way of deconstructing the narrative, I guess. Could you talk about this sort of this process of not just producing images, but also reducing images or taking them away, or the element of time?
Well, I think also I'm not so interested in the finished, or maybe we call it also maybe the perfect image, and this idea of breaking up a structure has always been a very important had a very important part in all my works, actually. I guess also, like you said, just these two works, it is also structured very differently, even though both has like a time capsule, you could say. But Left Hand of Darkness, it is also like it does not hold the images very long, but sometimes it seems like the wheels of the image making is just, I mean, it's coming together, and it rereads it again, reactivates itself through the images next to it, next to them. But it was very important for me that it didn't have like one image, but it's also very discouraging in a way, and I feel that I'm very ambivalent with this work still, even though I'm fascinated by that possibility that sometimes it goes in all directions and I don't know where it ends, and then but these moments, few moments that I myself has experienced when it starts to read from one corner with the bodies that somehow the choreographed bodies and the choreographed text and the meaning somehow starts to elaborate on itself, and then suddenly it falls apart again and it goes in different direction. Nothing fits together, so to speak. But I find it interesting that it has this opportunity of change in such a radical way that you can actually come back and have this experience of first have seen it and then not remembering that you saw this before, even though you know the piece, so to speak. But I know.
I'm just going to break up the structure here. We have lunch waiting for us, but I just want to take just 3 minutes for any questions or comments from I can then for myself say that I'm quite intrigued by this idea of becoming that is perhaps most explicitly played out in the Le Guin conversation, in a way, the way in which this gender identity shifts between man and woman or both. Could you just a few notes on that in relation to perhaps some kind of utopian cyborg creature that might point to what is not yet?
Yeah. Again, I mean, the Butler's idea around the construction of gender and sexuality is, of course, a huge interest of mine. But I think and we spoke a little bit about this morning, but to maybe speak about something totally different is to speak about, or something that I've been really fascinated by lately is the TV series True Blood that HBO has produced by Alan Ball. And I find that kind of, I mean, you can, the construction of the body, the construction of sexuality, and how little somehow we have moved the idea of do we identify, is it a biological construction, or is it a social political construction? And I think in this series it's a very fascinating and opening up of very different kind of possibilities, and it's the first time I've seen it so creatively used specifically in American TV. But you have werewolves, you have body shifters, people that shift into being dogs or werewolves, vampires. You have magicians. There are always, every time there is somehow a new invention of a new possibility, another situation, and it's set in the frame of today, and it's I think it's interesting to somehow reconstruct our relationship to the body and to sexuality and desire and I don't think we can do that from what we know. I think we have to somehow bring it in and rethink maybe all possibilities, also new, unknown possibilities. That could be spoken about in different ways.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.